I get that. Well, first of all, let's talk about like the specific term. What would you call what exists in America on the right today? What would you call, I mean, Trumpism, the MAGA movement? What would you say is the best way that you would have of encapsulating what exists now today?
Trump is reactionary populism that's bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
It uses the language and rhetoric of reactionary populism, and then in power just governs like a classic neoliberal Republican with some random Trump things thrown in, you'll have a kind of a trade war with China.
Broadway musical tunes,
Yeah, whatever. It's just random, but broadly speaking, I would think the rhetoric of Trump is just reactionary populist, which has a deep history going back to the founding of the republic. Now at a protest, saying you're a reactionary populist doesn't really work. Now you're talking about, use fascist, but again, it's not a particularly politically important thing. If I felt protest and online fighting was more important, then I would spend more time thinking about a better term. Or maybe I would say, in the wash, it's not accurate, but use fascism, but I just don't think it matters. And I think a lot of people listening to that are going to get annoyed, but it's just the way I view contemporary society.
Is there something, I think that phrase, reactionary populism is a good one. Do you think that or something else could function to illuminate that movement in such a way as to assist in disempowering it in a way that would be better and more accurate and to the point in a way that fascism is perceived as doing, or maybe it's not. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I don't think people who use the term fascist are very interested in understanding the rise of reactionary populism. I think that's pretty clear. But I mean, I would say I do think referring to it as reactionary populism helps suggest the material origins of the virulent racism. Not to say that it's only material origins. Of course, racism exists as an independent strand in history, and it shapes materiality, and particularly as we talked about. Chattel slavery is an economic project. Jim Crow is an economic project. Redlining was an economic real estate project. Right. So these things go together. But I think if you're willing to engage in politics, you have to, search for ways to ameliorate the sources of a reactionary populism. And on one hand, that's racism. And I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think DEA training seminars are going to make people who are that racist less racist. But I think you could denude the movement over time by attending to its material sources in addition to its ideological sources, is sort of like racism.
Sure. Yeah. There's a whole debate about, dealing with very superficial issues and dealing with structural issues. But, at the same time, in the same way that you describe fascism being thrown out as a catch-all term, certainly the term racist has, and I think you referred specifically to Dinesh D'Souza, has been attempted, again, in a very kind of shallow, superficial way, tried to be co-opted and then thrown back at Democrats in a way that kind of underscores his very poor understanding of American history. So then is racism itself a term that, although it may be accurate, really, I mean, is it accurate? Is the term racist, as it is generally used, accurate in American society, if fascism is not?
Well, people use the term racist to refer to people who own slaves, and people use the term racist to refer to, different forms of particularly anti-Black oppression today. Now, obviously, 1850 is different from 2024, but I think there are meaningful connections where you could use the term racist to describe ideology and structure. This isn't to say that what it meant to be a racist in 1960 Birmingham is the same as what it means to be a racist in 2024 New York. There are differences, but there are, family resemblances where I think you can use the same term and it's not necessarily occluding. I mean, it's all contextual.
Yeah. And how do I want to phrase this?
And then particularly one thing I want to add, there are certain elements of racism, I would say police violence, that while they have changed over time, there are significant continuities where you could use a term like structural racism to refer to 1965, 1995, and 2024 in a meaningful way, while recognizing 1960 is not the same thing as 2024.
So I guess what one question that I want to ask is, and this is kind of a tough one because I think really the answer to it lies, within our own history as a nation. Is there another era that we can be more usefully referring back to that describes the sorts of problems that we are encountering today in a way that it is popularly illuminative? I mean, I think the forces of racism and extreme capitalism in the way that they have played out in this country, really the only analog that I see is like our own earlier history, because they were so horrific and violent in a very specific way. Is that what we can most usefully draw on, or is there some other outside referent that we can bring in which can illuminate the political landscape in a way that the term fascism does not?
I forget the way I put it in the article, but I think the most salient thing to do is understand what's happening today through American history, and then recognizing that understanding 1880 will be less useful than understanding 1980 in general. Even though understanding 1880, I'm a historian, I do think it's useful if we're looking for like practical understandings or solutions as to what's going on now. Focus on the last 40, 50 years, less the last 150 years. So for that reason, I think it's important to understand things like indigenous indigenous genocide. I think it's important to understand things like chattel slavery. And there was actually indigenous slavery, so not to skirt over that. But if we're trying to understand what's happening in 2024, I think it's less useful to look towards like, quote unquote, an original sin, except insofar as a way to like provide the much broader context what they think is needed to understand what's going on. Now, the issue is a lot of the people at the big magazines, the big institutions are elite liberals who don't want to give up their money. Right. So they'd rather talk about 1850 than 1980 or Absolutely, 1990. Yeah. And that may be an issue, but that's a conversation for another time. I would point to the work of Matthew Karp, who's written about that for Harper.
Yes.
Who, if you want to, think a little bit more about that.
I did, and I listened recently because they came out on the Chapo Trap House feed of late with the full series of The Hell of Presidents, and he was was on one of the I believe the bonus episodes with them, and I will delve more deeply into Matthew Karp's material, because what I've heard so far is excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel Bessner. Again, the article that he wrote, and you should take a look at it, reconsider your use of the term. Again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to draw myself away from it, but I do want to hold out another perspective here. Does American fascism exist? The newrepublic.com, in the New Republic, it's actually from March 6th, 2023, but it certainly makes as much sense now as when it was written. And Daniel Bessner, again, associate professor in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington and the author of Democracy in Exile. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today on Facepalm America.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Facepalm America. I want to thank Ace Elson and Rosabelle Hine for being the producers of the show. Please go to facepalmamerica.com for more information about the program, and share this episode, if you could, on social media, on Twitter, and yes, I'm still going to call it Twitter, Threads, Facebook, whatever it happens to be. It really helps us to grow the base of our show. And until next time, enjoy the day.